Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another edition of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports, your home for news, game recaps, and analysis for all things Texas Longhorns sports. However, today we are not talking about the Texas Longhorns. We are continuing our college basketball team previews with the North Carolina Tar Heels from the Atlantic Coast Conference, or the ACC, who are right behind Duke right now in the betting odds to win the conference this year as they return RJ Davis, among many others, to their roster this year, but did lose Armando Bacot in the offseason. And joining me to talk about North Carolina today, as he always does, is my fantastic co-host, Mr. Emmy Nixon. If you like the series of college basketball team previews, make sure you like and subscribe and share it with your college basketball loving friends, as I'm sure you have many of them. I said that in a pretty sarcastic way. Maybe you have a lot of friends who like college basketball. They just don't watch it until March, like most other people do. Big mistake, but that's just my opinion. Let's go ahead and get into this, Emmy. First of all, how are you tonight? Before we do talk about Hubert Davis's squad.
I'm good, man. We just finished recording our Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports Ohio State, Penn State preview, and then we also did a little fun segment where we drafted some of our top players in college basketball. So check those out if you're interested. But yeah, there's a lot to get into with North Carolina. They're one of the fastest paces in college basketball. They're one of the teams every year that I have on a short list of teams that I think are the most fun to watch. Usually, with RJ Davis and the guys they usually have, like Brady Manick in years past, and they've had a lot of teams where they just get out and run. And last year they played a little bit better on the defensive end, and they're hoping to kind of take that into this year.
Yeah. So when we get into the strengths and weaknesses of this North Carolina Tar Heels roster for 2024-2025, last year they finished 29-8, really good year under Hubert Davis, 17-3 in the ACC, and they make a run to the Sweet 16 where ultimately they were knocked out by Alabama in the Sweet 16. They do lose quite a bit from last year's team, including one of its best defenders and rebounders in Harrison Ingram, who is now part of the San Antonio Spurs organization, and one of the best bigs in the sport over the last half decade in Armando Bacot, one of the best rebounders that we've ever seen in college basketball. So that does leave some question marks for this North Carolina roster, including the fact that they no longer have Armando Bacot and all those drop coverages. Rebounding could, in fact, be more of an issue for them this season, especially on the defensive end of the floor. And they have a lot of guards outside of RJ Davis who are really talented but aren't shooters. So how much floor spacing are they going to have? But at the same time, they have a lot of strengths. Their backcourt is as speedy and athletic as you can find. They've got really good depth. They have maybe the best shooter in the sport in RJ Davis. They now have a real stretch five. They bring in Kay Tyson, a guy from Belmont, who's in a very similar mold to a Brady Manick from a couple years ago. It's kind of like that stretch combo guard forward, stretch four type that can shoot it. So they do have some floor spacing in that respect. And they're going to have, with all their speed and athleticism, an elite transition attack. They're going to play North Carolina team basketball. But one of the things that made North Carolina really good a year ago is they finally bought in on the defensive side of the floor. And with Armando Bacot gone and kind of a void left there on the interior with Jalen Washington, who's a returning player from last year's team, how are they going to fill that void? On on the interior, on the defensive end of the floor, is one of my bigger questions that I need to see play out for this North Carolina team before I can give them the preseason declaration of like legitimate national title contender. I think they're right on the fringes of that right now with this roster and the talent that they have on it. And obviously one of the biggest storylines on this roster is Ian Jackson, who's a 5-star freshman guard that they're bringing in this season as a freshman. So, Emmy, what is your biggest question or concern for this North Carolina team this upcoming season?
Well, I think you said it. I think it's floor spacing. And even if some of these guys do shoot better than their prior expectations would, I guess, perceive them as, they're still not going to be guarded the same way as an RJ Davis, or not anyone's going to be guarded like RJ Davis. That's not a good example, but as some of as 40% shooters until they're proven over a long period of time. So early on in the season, the floor spacing might be a little bit clunky, but as the season goes on, I do expect some of these guys to, who will improve as shooters, I think, kind of establish themselves as guys that have to be guarded out there. And once that happens, I think it'll open up the floor and they can kind of cast their stride, similarly to how they did last year with 5 non-conference losses early on in the year, or whatever it ended up being. So that, I think, is the biggest concern for me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'd also, again, just point out front court scoring and rim protection in the void left by Armando Bacot. I think bringing in Van Allen Lubin from Vanderbilt, who will be a part of their front court rotation, even potentially a starter. We'll see how the starting rotation plays itself out to start the season. He has kind of that ridiculous motor, and he attacks the rim with a vengeance. And he could be kind of grow significantly into kind of that pick and roll partner for UNC's really solid backcourt. He's a good play finisher offensively, so maybe he can step into that role of being kind of the scorer on the interior along with Jalen Washington. He's also pretty comfortable handling the ball on the perimeter. And so if his 3-point stroke can continue to progress from where it was last year, and he can become the guy who provides kind of those 10 to 12 points a night on the interior, which is I think what they kind of brought him in for. Look, you're not going to replace a guy like Armando Bacot, but that would really go a long way into making this North Carolina team as well-rounded as possible. I think my X factors, given those weaknesses for North Carolina and all the strengths that we discussed, I have a couple. Number one is going to be Elliot Cadeau, who's going to be their starting point guard next to RJ Davis. I expect him to take a step up in his sophomore season to being an all ACC caliber guard. And he's just going to be kind of the set the table maestro for this North Carolina team. He's got to be more of a threat to score from 3-point range, to space the floor, and he knows that. It's one of the worst kept secrets in college basketball. But he's one of the top initiator guards already in America. So I think UNC can continue to have one of the best transition offenses in the country with a guard like Elliot Cadeau pushing the tempo, with the shooters that they're going to have running these outlet lanes with RJ Davis, who can pop it from anywhere, and Cade Tyson, who's a really effective shooter, the transfer from Belmont. But Cadeau is one of the best in the sport at pushing the tempo, scanning the floor, making those push-ahead passes. And so I think just from a initiating offense standpoint, from a pure point guard standpoint, he's going to be one of the best, not only in the conference, but in college basketball. The things that he needs to work on, though, to become more of a complete player is more consistently defensively, more consistency on that end of the floor, just in terms of a on-ball pest standpoint, and then obviously becoming more of a shooter. And then obviously, like we talk about with many of these blue bloods who get these 5-star freshmen, Ian Jackson is another X factor for me. He's oozing in the physical tools department. He's going to be a very good defender from the jump with the tools that he has. He's a legit 6'5", 6'6". He's a guy that, like, say in a matchup with Wake Forest and Hunter Salas, he's going to be the guy that's going to be asked a lot of the time to guard Hunter Salas on ball. And that's not an easy task, but that speaks to the level of talent and hyper-competitive dog that Ian Jackson is. He's not going to be a negative offensively. I think he's a good backcourt partner for RJ Davis and Elliot Cadeau, who aren't the strongest of on-ball defenders. He's going to be extremely dangerous in transition, which is where I like to fit with a guy like Elliot Cadeau and RJ Davis. But I do think the three-point shooting, again, this is the theme that we go back to again and again with the point you brought up, floor spacing. 28% last year with overtime elite. He just needs to make teams respect him from out there. And I think with the developmental resources and the staff that they have at North Carolina, I think he can make that leap maybe later on in the year in January and February going into the tournament for North Carolina. So I think Ian Jackson and, of course, Elliot Cadeau being the biggest X factors, surrounded by RJ Davis, who's going to be an All-American if he stays healthy. Do you have any other comments?
Possibly National Player of the Year.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to add is just the thing that coincides with floor spacing is just the half-court offense in general, because you're not going to have the luxury of getting all of those offensive rebounds that Armando Bacot and Harrison Ingram were creating. And with that, the half-court offense might struggle a little bit. We know that what they can do when they get out and run. But certain teams, certain matchups throughout a season, they're going to get them into half-court scenarios, and how are they going to be able to respond to that?
Yeah, I think the biggest pull for North Carolina in the offseason, aside from the freshman Ian Jackson, was getting Cade Tyson from Belmont, who's going to be a starting wing for this North Carolina team. He's a useful rebounder, but his specialty is being a catch-and-shoot floor spacer. Miami was the only ACC ball club that made more transition three-pointers last year than North Carolina. We know North Carolina wants to get out and run, like we've mentioned already 100 times in the 13 minutes that we've been talking about them here tonight. But you look at kind of the quick trigger wing who can be a floor spacer, can get out and knock down those transition three-pointers. RJ Davis is a flamethrower, but you lose Cormac Ryan, who was a transfer from Notre Dame last season, who shot 51% from three last year, and you lose Harrison Ingram, who was 40% last year. So that's a lot to lose in that department. Cade Tyson is going to be really important in replacing that production from outside. 6'7", 205-pound wing, 46% from downtown last year. 16 transition three-pointers at Belmont. He's going to be a guy that will run the floor and play smart. My only concern is he's not going to be a guy that creates a ton of offense for himself. So that's where Elliot Cadeau comes into the equation. You have RJ Davis, yes. But outside of that, unless you're going to rely on a freshman, Ian Jackson, to do it for you, they need Elliot Cadeau to become more of a scorer offensively, and that's why he's, I think, one of the biggest X factors in college basketball this season. But the good thing for Cade Tyson is he has the guards and the things around him to get him the open shots. RJ Davis is going to hold so much gravity in this offense that Cade Tyson will get his fair share of open shots, and he's just got to knock them down at a respectable clip. And then I guess, as I talked about Van Lubin, the transfer from Vanderbilt, whether he starts or he doesn't, just needs to provide, along with Jalen Washington, they need some interior post scoring to replace some of the void left by Armando Bacot. That's going to be really important, especially in a league where you have Cooper Flagg, you have all of these bigs that are going to be in the ACC this year. The guy at Clemson, I forget his name, but there are a lot of good interior players in this league. They're going to need some scoring from their front court. So I think that about says it for North Carolina. In terms of your expectation for the Tar Heels, do you quite see it as Final Four, or do you think it's get back to the second weekend of the tournament where they were last year? What do you think?
I think it's get back to the second weekend. I think this is one of those teams that as the season goes along, the expectations might change, just because I expect them to maybe get off to a little bit of a slower start and catch their stride around late January, February. But I also think, in terms of what they're capable of, they can make a Final Four because they have arguably the best player in the country in RJ Davis. But they can also lose in the first round too if he has an off night. That's the interesting thing about them.
Yeah, I think it's compete for the ACC. They could win the ACC regular season title. Duke's not going to be easy to beat, though. I think Duke's one of those teams that with its youth is going to peak in January, February. So if you're North Carolina, maybe you want to also be peaking around that time period. I mean, all teams do. But you could, you throw these teams in the ACC tournament in Greensboro or wherever they play it nowadays. I don't know if it's Charlotte, Greensboro, or New York City. They've played it in all three locations the past half decade.
Yeah. I think it's New York City.
Anything can happen in a tournament style, conference tournament style setup. So I think you could see North Carolina maybe win the regular season or maybe win the ACC regular season title, and then from there it's about getting back to the second weekend at a minimum. I think an Elite Eight appearance is kind of where I see their ceiling right now with all these unanswered questions in their front court. But I do think, like you mentioned, they could, of course, end up in the Final Four if some of those questions get answered. So I'm rooting for North Carolina, man. I have a cousin who's graduating from Chapel Hill in a month. I have a family that went to North Carolina all over the place, so I'll be rooting for the Tar Heels to some extent, as long as they're not playing a team in the burnt orange come tournament time. So that's about it. Thank you guys for tuning in to our North Carolina Tar Heels preview. If you're a Tar Heel fan, knowing that your football team kind of sucks, sorry Mike Brown, but you kind of suck this year.
Yeah.
And you're gearing up for college basketball, as I know they do at that school. Let us know what you think of your team this year. What are your expectations for the Tar Heels? And what are your concerns going into the season? I believe it's on next Friday around this time that they will face Kansas in an early season matchup. So I don't know if I'll be watching that game because I'll be in Washington, D.C., probably drinking beers with my dad at a bar. Maybe I'll be watching the game. Who knows? But let us know what you think of your team. And we will see you next time on one of these college basketball previews or on Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports. So go Tar Heels for those of you out there, and peace out.
Peace.
All right.